Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to Cal State Fullerton's College of Humanities and Social Sciences panel on race and policing. I'm Dr. Christy Gardner, and I'm going to be moderating this event along with my colleague, Dr. Rob Castro. We are both professors within the Division of Politics, Administration, and Justice. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can take a look at it as I'm talking. We are really excited to have our panelists here today, and we're excited to have you here with us. So we have Mr. Sarabia from UCLA and Professor Ocean from Loyola Law School and Chief Goodman from Upland Police Department, who are going to be sharing their expertise and their experiences with us today. And we're looking forward to a really great conversation around race, policing, and reforms. Just a couple housekeeping details. We are going to go ahead and record this. In fact, it's already being recorded, and this will be made available on the Cal State Fullerton website either later today or tomorrow. The discussion is open to the public, so media have been invited to attend and may be observing or participating. If you are with a media organization, please attach your name and affiliation to any questions that you might ask. Today's panel is going to be separated into 3 separate segments of about 20 to 30 minutes each, with an audience Q&A afterwards. If you have any questions for the panelists, please put those in the Q&A. You'll find that on the bottom of your screen for most viewers. These are the questions that we're going to draw from during the program. And if you have general comments or questions, please use the chat function, which you'll also find on the bottom of your screen. Before Dr. Castro introduces our expert panelists and we hear from them, I want to go ahead and set the stage by providing an overview of policing, just so that we have some basic facts that we can all kind of agree on and understand about policing before we go forward today. So let me go ahead and do that. So first off, our system of law enforcement is decentralized, fragmented, and local. What does that mean? That means we have more than 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the United States. There's over 12,500 municipal or city police departments and another 3,000 county sheriff's departments. About 3/4 of all of our sworn officers work for these local police and sheriff's departments. Why is this important? It's important because each of these 18,000 agencies has its own culture, it does its own hiring, it has its own training standards, its own hiring standards, its own policies, use of force, everything else, right? Of course, within state and federal law, but we're talking about 18,000 different agencies when we're talking about and thinking about reform. Living in Southern California, it's really hard to believe, but 50% of our agencies across the country employ fewer than 10 sworn officers. I don't think we have any agencies in Southern California that are that small. 75% of agencies employ fewer than 25 sworn officers. So I want you to really think about that. Over 75% of our agencies across the country have fewer than 25 officers. In Orange County, we have 2 agencies that are of that size, La Palma and Los Alamitos Police Department. So even though most agencies are small, most officers work for large and very large agencies. Most of us recognize that policing is a male-dominated field. Only about 12% of officers nationwide are women. Although that percentage is typically a little bit higher in Southern California, we do tend to have more diverse departments across the board, and that includes in the male-female divide. About 1/4 of officers identify as a racial or ethnic minority. About 12% nationwide identify as Black, and 12% identify as Latina, Latino, Latinx, Hispanic. Again, Southern California tends to be much more diverse than the rest of the country. And given the unique powers and the complex nature of the job of police officer, as well as the important powers that officers are given, it's really, really important that we hire and recruit the right individuals to be police officers, right? And that we weed out those who are not morally up to the job. So I want you to know that for this reason, police officers undergo a more thorough vetting than almost any other job that exists out there. However, It's also important to know that with all those 18,000 agencies, with all of their different hiring standards and practices, that every agency sets its own hiring and training standards, again, within usually state law, but also federal law. So those standards vary a lot, and they are dependent on a lot of different factors, including resources, as well as access to quality candidates. In California, you might be surprised to find out that fewer than 5% of applicants who apply to be police officers are hired. And many of them don't even make it through the academy or through the field training process afterwards. In California, the average police academy is about 5 to 6 months long, and there is an additional 3 to 6 months or more in the field of field training with their agency. California has some of the highest training standards in the country. The chart that you're looking at depicts the percent of college-educated officers across the United States by region. The average percent is 30%. So on average, 30% of officers nationwide has a bachelor's degree or higher. The vast majority of agencies only require a high school diploma to become a police officer. Only one state, ironically Minnesota, requires police recruits to have an associate's degree upon hire, and a couple other states, Michigan and Wisconsin in particular, require recruits to have 60 units within 5 years of being hired. As you can see, agencies in the Northeast and the Pacific have the highest proportions of college-educated officers, while agencies in the South and in the mountain region have the lowest percentages. And there's quite a big difference. It's about half of what the Northeast has. You can see the Midwest there is in the middle. Looking on the right side of the dotted line, you can see Orange County and LA County. Now these two numbers are actually a few years older than the data on the left side. And those numbers, so having 52.6% of officers in Orange County having a bachelor's degree or better, that actually is higher today than it was when those data were collected. So having a college degree or having a lot of officers with a college degree helps an agency because there are some benefits of having a college-educated workforce. However, that does not keep agencies out of trouble, and college-educated officers are not perfect officers. I don't want to give you guys that impression, but we do have a very professional workforce here in Southern California in comparison to other regions of the country. So finally, I want to point out that in the United States, we have two systems of social control: informal social control and formal social control. We, the people, as in you and I, our parents, our neighbors, our teachers, our coaches, our clergy members, our colleagues and our friends, and anybody else within our vicinity are considered informal social control. We're the ones who kind of convince one another to adhere to social norms and laws and to be law-abiding citizens, right? While this is generally effective, most of us are law-abiding, it isn't always effective. And that's why we need a system of formal social control. And that is our police. That's the function. That is their purpose. So in spite of the differences I just described between all these different law enforcement agencies in the United States, all of them have the same essential purpose. And that is to protect life, liberty, and property. So police exist to protect our constitutional rights. And it's important to think of officers in this regard, as opposed to simply enforcing laws or maintaining order, because this reminds us of their ultimate purpose, which is as guardians of democracy. And key to this discussion is that police officers are agents of the government. And that's important. That's their representatives of the government. And this means that they derive their authority from us, the people, and they are accountable to us, the people, which means that they are generally we consider police to be our most visible agents of government, right? And that's why legitimacy is so crucial, not just for public safety, but just for democracy in general, because without our authority, police cannot do the job we've entrusted them to do. So they rely on us to give them their authority. So, and because police are one of the only groups that are given the right to use coercive force against other groups, it is vitally important that police are viewed as legitimate, because they cannot be effectual if they are not viewed as legitimate by the citizenry. So members of society have to agree that police use of coercive force is both morally appropriate and valid, in other words, legitimate. And the current protests and calls for reform make it crystal clear that right now the public is challenging police legitimacy. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Castro to introduce our panelists and get us started on this discussion today.
Okay, thank you, Christy, for that overview. So I have the unique pleasure of welcoming our panelists today and sharing with the audience a little bit about them. They are uniquely qualified to speak on the subject of race and policing. And so we have three individuals that really accomplished people who have carved time out of their schedule to be with us. So the first is Saul Sarabia, who is an LA native. He began his work as a community organizer where he focused on racial justice and the legal system in the 1999 at the Community Coalition in South Los Angeles. He pioneered organizing for formerly incarcerated people with social service providers, their clients and family members of system impacted people. He has been an advisor to the LA chapter of All of Us or None of Us. He's a graduate of the UCLA School of Law, where in his own studies, he emphasized critical race studies. And after graduation, he taught at both the Chicano and Chicano Studies Department at UCLA, as well as led the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA Law School. So today he runs a political consulting firm called Solidarity, and also has an appointment at the UCLA Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, where he focuses on the future of work in decarcerated California. So welcome, Saul. Our next panelist is Priscilla Ocean, who's a professor of law at Loyola Law School. She teaches criminal law, family law, and a seminar on race, gender, and the law. In her work, she explores the ways in which race, gender, and class interact to render women of color vulnerable to various forms of violence and criminalization. Her research has appeared in law reviews such as the California Law Review, the UCLA Law Review, the George Washington Law Review, UC Davis Law Review, and the Du Bois Review. Professor Ocean has received the inaugural PEN American Writing for Justice Literary Fellowship, and she served as a 2019-2020 Fulbright Fellow, and she was based out of a school of law in Kampala, Uganda, where she studied the relationship between gender-based violence and women's incarceration. She is also co-author with Professors Kimberly Crenshaw of the influential policy report, Black Girls Matter, Pushed Out, Overpoliced, and Underprotected. This report highlights the various forms of discipline and punishment experienced by Black girls, but which is often overlooked in mainstream advocacy circles. She has served as a trainer for the federal public defenders, assisted with the development of new programs in domestic violence centers in South Los Angeles, and is also a member of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department Oversight Commission. So Professor, welcome. Our third panelist for this evening is Darren Goodman, who is the Chief of Police for the Upland Police Department, and he was appointed on July 16th, 2018. Prior to that, he was captain for the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department, commander of the Bland Regional Training Center, and police chief for the Chino Hills Police Department. Chief Goodman has a commitment to data-driven policies, policing principles, civic partnerships, and community engagement, which have earned him a reputation as a results-oriented leader. He's also a strong advocate for community policing and routinely facilitates community forums to engage citizens and increase stakeholder inclusion. Chief Goodman holds a doctorate in organizational change and leadership from USC. He also has a master's of public administration from USC as well. And also in 2015, Chief Goodman graduated from the prestigious Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government Senior Executives Program in State and Local Government. On top of all of that, he's also an adjunct professor at the California State University, San Bernardino. So thank you all again. We are delighted to have you here. So during the summertime, the Dean for Humanities and Social Sciences, her office contacted my department and wanted us to create a panel that focused in on race policing and reform. And so the prevailing context that really breathed life into this panel was the spike in deadly encounters that had happened between the police and principally young men of color. Of course, we should note instances exist like that which happened with Breonna Taylor. And this reignited calls for reform. And we saw that throughout the summer, multicultural crowds that protested in the street. And so given that, we have organized this panel around 3 themes. And so I'm going to go ahead and segue into the first theme. And so the death of George Floyd brought protesters into the street this summer to decry kind of police violence and to demand police reforms. And so for each of the panelists, in your opinion, what is or are the main problems that brought us here that need to be addressed? Chief Goodman, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Well, first, I just want to say I appreciate being invited to be on the panel, especially with the other esteemed guests that are here. And I want to give a disclaimer up front that I don't propose to have all the answers. I'm hoping to hear and learn as much as possible from the panelists myself, because this is an issue that deserves discussion, and I appreciate being part of a civil discussion. But to your question, what is involved in the problem, or how do we get here? I think that's multi-pronged. I don't think that there's one issue that got us here. I would strongly agree that George Floyd's death was indeed a flashpoint. That was a flashpoint that started the discussion as we're having today. But if we look at the state of policing and the state of community relations, it goes back further than that. And there are a myriad of issues that go into that. One was discussed at the inception, which is public trust, the slow erosion of that trust as defined and distinguished by incidents, small and large. There's also an education piece where, we as police haven't done enough to bring the community in to understanding our role, understanding why we do what we do. We've historically operated in a veil of I don't want to say secrecy, but there's protections over personnel investigations and law concerning what can be revealed. So when an incident does occur, that goes public, that's captured by cell phone video, the police organizations are often not able to immediately discuss the issue because it takes on the nature of an ongoing criminal and administrative personnel investigation. So that sometimes shrouds the incident in what is now most notably characterized as an intent to cover something up. And then we get into the deeper historical issues of where African Americans specifically have been in society as a whole, and the police relationship with some of those historical government, government sanctioned actions. And I'm certainly not one to be a historian, but I can just attest to my own upbringing and understanding that it's not unusual for young African Americans to have a fear of the police or a distrust of the police, and that also extends to other communities of color. And so how we got here and why we are where we are, we could talk all night just about that, the breakdown of other social institutions, whether it's education, the mental health industry, whether we're talking about, the lack of equity in housing, banking, whatever it is, the police are often the recipients of society's ills that play out on the streets with split seconds to make decisions about, good, bad, life, death, right, wrong. And so, none of that can be discounted, but not one thing is the sole reason for where we are. I think they're all contributing factors. And, where we go from here is critical, so that's why I'm happy to be a part of the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. Professor Ocean, so Chief Goodman seems to suggest that what brought us here at the space and place that we're at, that it's certainly broader than use of force issues. What's your take on this? What is the depth and scope of the problem or problems that's going on right now?
She's on mute.
Oh,
sorry, I had my phone muted.
That's okay.
So what I was saying is, that's a big question that you're asking. Sort of, what is the source of the problem? And I'll say, that unlike the chief, I do claim to have all the answers. So, you'll have to make sure to listen to me. So I think this is a historical. This is a question of the historical record. I think the Chief Goodman, and I'll give you a shout out. I'm from Ontario, Chief Goodman, so I grew up not too far from you there in Upland. This is a matter of the historical record in terms of what we are asking law enforcement to do, and I think it's important for us to really zero in on where and how modern police departments were created. When we talk about police, we talk about them in ways as though they're ahistorical, as if they have always existed, and that they've always existed in the form that we see them in our communities, and that's simply not the case. Modern police departments were created in the 19th century, and they grew out of informal patrols, for example, regulating free labor in the North, ensuring that property was protected. They also regulated individuals who were considered to be vagrants or loiterers, individuals who did not have jobs or who violated social norms at the time, to regulate what's called sort of precarious labor, to ensure that individuals who are poor would be available for labor exploitation in an emergent capitalist system in the United States. And so, before police departments were created in places like Massachusetts and Boston, those are some of the first police departments that were formalized. You had industry titans, essentially, and those who were of the 1% of their day, essentially paying private security to police and protect their property. That then grew into police departments that were then funded by local communities and regulated by local communities. But again, their task was rooted in the regulation of free labor and the protection of private property. So I think it's important for us to keep that in mind in terms of where the modern police department came from in the North. In the South, police departments grew out of slave patrols, i.e. those informal formations that were designed to regulate labor, in this case, enslaved labor, enslaved people of African descent, to ensure that they would be available for wholesale exploitation in a capitalistic system that essentially propped up the modern United States. And that is the story of how police departments were formed, to protect private property and to ensure the availability of cheap, on the one hand, in the North, and free labor in the South, which then facilitated the growth of the American economy. And so when we think about that, our police departments and law enforcement agencies come out of a tradition that's steeped in white supremacy, that's steeped in capitalism, and that's steeped in the exploitation of people and property. And so when we now reflect on the role that police departments play in our modern communities, it wasn't until really the middle part of the 20th century that the federal government began to get involved in police departments, where police departments were professionalized, and you begin to have more coordination across local municipalities, states, and the federal government in terms of federal funding for law enforcement, which allowed law enforcement entities to expand. So Professor Gardner, noting that so many of our police departments are small, right, is a reflection of the way in which our police agencies have evolved over the last, 150, 200 years. So the work that police departments do in our communities today continues to be steeped in white supremacy, continues to be steeped in cis-heteronormativity, capitalism, and patriarchy, because that's where they were founded. And so the problems that we have with regard to the use of the police to regulate communities of color is a feature and not a bug, right? Police departments were used to maintain racialized boundaries in the context of Jim Crow, in the context of the abolition of slavery. Like, the police departments were on the front lines of maintaining racial hierarchy, and they continue to be today. And I think it's important to note that it's not just police departments, it's also other governmental agencies that participate in these forms of racialized and gendered social control. So in the work that I do, I look at the ways in which schools function as forms of social control, the way in which educational institutions mete out punishment against people who are seen as non-conforming as a result of their race, their gender, sexuality, disability. And so there are all kinds of markers of difference that are policed in a variety of different ways. We can talk about social welfare institutions and the way in which they police the bodies and the reproductive choices of Black women. Although it doesn't land Black women in prison all that often, it does regulate their behavior, and it punishes them in a variety of different ways when they are seen as behaving in ways that are non-normative. And at times, there's a lot of great work on this. I've written about this. Karen Gustafson, people like Michelle Goodwin, Kimberly Crenshaw, have written about the ways in which there is an intersection between welfare institutions and police departments that lead to increased criminalization for poor people of color. So again, these are features and not bugs. And although we may have police officers and police chiefs who are working in good faith against this backdrop, they often are unable to transform these institutions because it's deeply embedded within the culture. And while you may have officers and police chiefs and leadership that want to do the right thing, often what dictates outcome is not the individual disposition of any individual officer or any individual person in leadership or sets of people in leadership. It is the environments that they find themselves in. And that often shapes how people behave, and it shapes outcomes more than an individual's disposition or the education that an individual brings into a department. And this is something, a theory of social psychology called the situational actor. So actors perform based on the situation and the incentives that are provided within the situational context that they find themselves in. And from my perspective, particularly as someone who sits on the Civilian Oversight Commission for one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country, the incentives are to police in very heavy-handed, violent ways, communities of color, poor communities, people who are unhoused. And so we continue to see that perpetuated throughout these institutions because there are incentives that reward arrest, that reward disrespect, that reward the use of excessive force in communities that are seen as deviant, that are devalued, that are racially marginalized, right? So because they are seen as being a threat to social order and they are seen as needing to be controlled. And why haven't we been able to fix this? We haven't been able to fix this through democratic processes, and I'm glad that you teed this up, Professor Gardner, because right, the idea is that police derive their legitimacy from we the people, right? They are supposed to serve as the guardians of democracy to promote the rule of law. And so we assume then that we can use democratic processes to reform police departments. And what I'm increasingly coming to believe is that democratic reforms, like the commission that I sit on, often don't work for two reasons. One is they're not well equipped to understand the core problem. And so what happens is as we attempt to solve the problem, we simply enlarge the scope of law enforcement. We provide them with additional resources, but we don't fundamentally change the problem. And so law enforcement continues to expand, but the problems aren't addressed. And so we legitimize and we paper over these problems by providing more resources like body cameras or civilian oversight commissions or new jails. But the core, right, that early history, the white supremacy, the regulation of labor and the monitoring of property simply hasn't been addressed. And the other reason I think that democratic reforms don't work is that all too often police departments act in ways that are anti-democratic. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they often defy civilian leadership. You can look at, the city of New York in terms of how police unions attempted to undermine democratically elected mayors, or here in Los Angeles County when the police unions sent out mailers with a literal target on the back of a Black assemblyman, Reggie Sawyer. You see this when police departments and police officers defy constitutional standards that are imposed upon them by, for example, the Fourth Amendment. They defy consent decrees. They undermine democratic leadership that attempts to challenge them. And they do things like lie in court, for example, defying established principles of truth-telling in the context of a judicial proceeding. So there are very few checks, I think, effective checks on the power of law enforcement, particularly when they misuse that power. And so for that reason, we haven't, even over the course of these 150 years, been able to effectively root out that core function of police as they were established 200 years ago with respect to white supremacy and control of property and labor.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me pivot quickly over to Saul. Saul, and I wanted to kind of pick up on a chord that Professor Ocean touched on. So she suggests that there's this continuity between historical forms of racialized coercion and today's policing institutions. And I guess I wanted to have you talk a little bit about how this has impacted the policing culture from where you sit. So from the work you've been involved in, is policing culture, has it become too militaristic or adversarial? And so then what we're seeing in terms of the spike in deadly encounters is just a natural byproduct of that. What do you think, Saul?
Thank you for the question, Rob. And thanks to everybody who's participating, my co-panelists. I'm going to also shout out the IE, Chief Goodman. I have a godson that is living in Upland and 3 years old. And I enjoy a lot of time out there in the beautiful foothills. And was happy to be on the panel with Priscilla, who's the OG Ontario resident that started a long-term relationship in terms of this kind of work with me when she was enrolled in our critical race studies program. I really appreciate this question because I think where the point of departure about how we got here was also asked relates to this. And I want to make sure that we name that the mass uprisings after George Floyd's murder in police custody were not just about police violence generally, but about police institutions and the impunity over this kind of violence, particularly as it involved Black bodies, was really what provided, I think, a unifying theme around protesting systemic racism in the larger society and specifically within law enforcement in the United States. And I say this in relation to your question now, Rob, because I think it is important for us to build on the history that that Priscilla was mentioning in terms of the bridge to the modern era. And this might be also just because in my age now, this is what I remember very directly, and that is that, you know, the youth who were on the streets probably didn't live through or even learn about the 1992 civil unrest that we in this county lived through in another very similar moment. And the same is true for our generation. I was in college when that happened around the 1965 Watts rebellion and the sort of police community contact and death that particular historical event involved. But I think it's important to name those because on the one hand, I think what they say to the society, how they would answer this question is that there's something that's persistent across time, that history matters, that we can't say is necessarily exceptional about this particular moment, and that people seem to have an understanding of when these moments happen. And I think that it's important when we talk about the outrage, the social outrage, the delegitimization that we're referring to name that there's something about this impunity, the reoccurring inability of the court system, of the Fourth Amendment, of legislative fixes to address some of these issues that seem to be deeply embedded in something else. And yet every generation has a different version of the same problem. So on the one hand, I think it is important to speak to something that may be happening now. I think that it's important to say that the time period after the Michael Brown death, the Trayvon Martin death, and killings, to now, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, all of these episodes, Philando Castile, that this generation has been able to see on their Facebook feeds and all of this suggests something about the particularized way that violence is expressed today and what the relationship is between these institutions and the cultures that not only seem to feed the kind of behavior that leads to these particular outcomes, but the ways in which the courts and the law appear to have no relief, right? Provide no relief, much less an ability for us to imagine that things might be different, to prevent these things in the first place, much less to hold people accountable to them. And I do think that the whether it's social media induced or the ways in which the political discourse has created sort of a delegitimization broadly of democratic institutions today, also relates to why people express a lack of faith that the very institutions, the very order that we're saying these institutions are designed to uphold, that there's sort of an underlying doubt about those very institutions. And for this, I think it's important to say that it is not just an issue of, it is very important to do what we've said here, but several people have said already, which is this inquiry cannot be an inquiry about individual officer behavior. There is something structural to, as suggested by your question, about the culture of policing that is important to be able to name and be precise about in terms of how it's reproduced and how it's acquired, and also how our democratic institutions and processes are equipped to respond to them. And so it's important, I think, to be able to say there is something in the moment that we're living in right now that feels very familiar, and that's the impunity piece, right? 65, 92, 2020. There is a thread there about who's victimized, about who's perpetuating the violence, and about who the courts seem to reinforce as valuable, right? In terms of what our system of justice is supposed to produce. And I think that does speak to the question of a crisis of legitimacy. In 1992, after the civil unrest here in Los Angeles, the American Bar Association took it upon themselves to do focus groups across the United States with communities of color. And the question was simply, do you have faith that the criminal justice system, the courts in particular, not the police, that the courts are not free of racial bias? And the answer across all racial groups in minority communities was absolutely not, like by leaps and bounds. And for us to be in this moment in 2020, seeing that reproduced in a different way does point to a larger conversation that I think has to bring in the structural. So I do think that the question around police culture is linked to the broader question of our societal culture. The other thing that I think is important from our localized context to name, and that has been a big issue in communities of color and has recently sort of resurfaced in the popular imagination because of news stories, is the presence of organized gangs within some of these law enforcement agencies, with not just implicit biases towards the kinds of moments and the historical precursors that Priscilla was talking about, but actively promoting white supremacist attacks on communities of color and other officers. The most recent of which has been claims and settlements paid out in our county regarding other police who alleged abuse at the hands of some of these organized forces inside of law enforcement agencies. And so for me, I think this skying out that you're leading us in this very first part of our conversation is very important, because to me, it's not disassociated from the resurgence of a certain type of white nationalism across the country that the federal law enforcement agencies have said is the biggest threat to the biggest domestic terrorist threat that we have. And so this, I think, creates an opportunity to be able to ask how our officers of color who are working within this larger societal context, how are communities of color that are policed in this context impacted by these, and what is our expectation around resolving these beyond a particular settlement or beyond investigatory tools to distinguish the cultural problems that might just be about a certain aggression, a certain culture of aggression, and this harboring, encouraging, and financing through our public taxpayer money the phenomenon, the larger phenomenon that folks are living through also around white nationalism. And I think that moving to the structural is a very important point of departure for this conversation.
So thank you so much for that response. You know, problems are, as has been described, extraordinarily complex and enigmatic in a lot of ways. But also what I detected is that there are a number of stakeholders here that have different interests involved in the issue of race and policing. And so I wanted to transition off and hand the ball to my colleague for segment 2.
Thanks, Rob. So those are just fantastic panelists. Thank you so much for those great openings. And Mrs. Straube, you kind of just led right into our next segment, which is what's at stake, right? And for all of these different constituencies, for community members, especially communities of color, what's at stake for police officers and police agencies, and then how do we balance our constitutionality? So Chief Goodman, do you want to go ahead and take the question about what's at stake, you think, for police officers and police departments, specifically thinking about police legitimacy within the eyes of the communities that they police, as well as police safety, as well as, you know, many of the other things that Saul picked up on?
Well, you know, from a practical standpoint, the biggest thing that's at stake is what we just described, which is our legitimacy. You know, we can't do the job. People don't trust us to do it fairly and equitable and with respect for all people. You know, I will say, as much as I appreciated the walk down the history lesson, and Dr. Ocean, I was familiar with some of those issues, so I misspoke when I said I didn't know any of that. But I can tell you that when we're out on the streets and when we're dealing with behavior, which is a driver of police contacts, many of the people that we're dealing with, you know, aren't connected to that history. And, you know, I you know, push back a little about spending more time dealing with the history that we're talking about, as opposed to dealing with the behavior that we're seeing today, and those issues that drive a lot of the contacts that end up being unfortunate and resulting in the loss of people of color. Because I care about that, and I think we all do. I care about the loss of any life. I don't know an officer who wants to take a life. You know, and Dr. Ocean mentioned something about awards and incentives for disrespect and for excessive force. I don't know that to be happening at any agency. I can't defend an agency that I don't work at, but I can tell you 100% that doesn't happen at Upland PD. There are no incentives for disrespect. There's actually discipline for that. There's no incentive for you know, excessive force. You know, we don't encourage that. You know, but we can't leave out of the equation behavior and the societal connection that is basically a culture of violence. You know, and that culture of violence isn't just in policing, you know, or it's asserted that it is, but that's not factual at all. I mean, we respond to acts of violence day in and day out. Just over the weekend in Los Angeles on Sunday, there was 5 murders, you know, in the single night. You know, I don't want to, you know, say anything disparaging about Chicago, but we know what's happening there and across other large cities across the nation. So we can't just talk about those less than 1% of the incidents that result in police use of force, and even less than 1% result in the death of any individual, without talking about the violence that's happening on the streets and the violence that's being perpetuated in the communities of color. African Americans, I think, in Los Angeles represent less than 10% of the population, but are responsible, and it pains me to say this, for over 44% of the crime. And, you know, those other societal institutions, have to bear some of the brunt of that. We have to start talking about those things. And you did, Dr. Ocean, where, we have to talk about schools. We have to talk about the court systems. We have to talk about mental health and all of those things that contribute to what police ultimately are the recipients of.
Thank you, Chief Goodman. Mrs. Sarabia, so what's at stake for communities of color in all of this, especially in terms of public safety and crime reduction?
I would start by just saying that I think the invitation to talk about the here and now and the police community contact is a really good opportunity to delve into this question around what's at stake. So for communities of color that are experiencing the level of violence in the communities that the chief is referring to, and also police violence, is essentially a matter of life and death. I would like to actually ground my comments in a description of a specific police reform project, for lack of another word, that I was drawn into since the George Floyd murder. And that is that, like many communities around the country, one of the 88 cities in LA County had a mass uprising of its residents come in and say, we want you to review public safety, and we want to take money from our police department where we can into the kinds of things that would prevent these kinds of incidents from happening in the first place. And where that city started was, let's actually study what is the infrastructure of our public safety in this city, and where we might be able to reprioritize our emphasis on the way that we do policing, what we fund with our public taxpayer money. This was a very public process. I facilitated all of the meetings. We did focus groups with everything ranging from the police union in that city all the way over to youth of color who were participating in a diversion program that city had taken up. This is the city of Culver City. And it was very clear to me that for the people of color that were involved in this process, we were talking about nothing less than expanding the definition of public safety so that the ability to not live with the fear that simply being Black in public, that simply being a person of color driving through this city would actually act against one's safety. And I think one of the things that I learned, and that I think all of us learned throughout that process, was just how common it is to have the mundane be criminalized, so that we could have the kinds of statistics that the chief was referencing. And so one of the things is we took a deep dive into what are the top 5 things that people are arrested for here, who's arrested and under what circumstances, and why do those disparities exist. And I think that it would, I would be remiss not to suggest that part of what the public is asking right now is a reimagination about what should be the nature of police and police community contact, and to take out of an abstraction this question of whether or not the legitimacy of the police force can be strengthened through retraining, for example. And I'll go as far as to say that some of the things that we heard community members say, as painful as it might be, is the police have disqualified themselves from doing things like enforcing traffic infractions, simply because, I apologize, there seems to be a pattern in which, for some reason, in jurisdictions big and small, rural and urban, people of color die in some of these encounters. And that is something that's happened throughout the decades, and we simply will not stand for it as taxpayers anymore. And I think that in addition to being a question of legitimacy, it is a question also of budgeting priorities, and it's a question of how to support police to be able to respond to things like violent crimes that are happening in the moment versus mental health calls that have to do with substance use, calls that have to do with non-violent people that police folks are simply not trained to be on the front lines about, and maybe didn't even sign up for in the police academy. And so I think that these kinds of inquiries that are a deep dive into the numbers in each of these local jurisdictions. I mean, you mentioned, Christine, that we have a very decentralized system, but we live in the largest county in the United States of America, which if we were a state, we would be the 8th largest state. What happens here with our county sheriffs and what happens within those 88 jurisdictions to answer these hard questions in a different way could be very important for the rest of the country. In that process, we heard enough of an appetite for things like not just taking police out of enforcement of traffic stops, but also looking at models that brought in people trained to deal with people that are having mental health issues, with EMTs, nurses, and other people who do not have guns to respond to those kinds of issues. And so I think that this is the moment that we're being invited into as a community, because the larger thing that I'll just mention is on the table for all of us, I do think, is a governance question. There is a pandemic, tax revenues are going down. Every city agency is going to have to figure out how to deal with those. And to the extent that taxpayers are saying, this is a piece of what is currently asked of police to do that could be done in a cheaper and in a more effective way, and that would actually increase their availability to respond to violent crime versus things like mental health calls, that we should explore all models. And I think that without embracing and going deep into that inquiry, the other thing that's at stake is, people's jobs in the future, right? Because the officers that have been conscripted into the current system and around which we've built job security deserve to be in a process where they identify what a just transition looks like for their skill sets into the kinds of work that they signed up for.
Thank you. And bringing in, thinking about this crisis of legitimacy, thinking about what police are called to do, not called to do, what their toolbox equips them properly to do, what their training and education equips them properly to do. I'd like to turn to Priscilla, to Professor Ocean, and ask about how do we balance our the constitutional sides of this, right? Of both due process and protecting communities of color from crime. What do you see as this best approach?
Well, so I think it's important for us to get on the same page in terms of some facts and thinking about this question of, balancing the rights of communities and individuals. I think we should all have the right to be free from violence. We all want a society where we can feel safe in our bodies, in our homes, in our communities. We all want to be respected. We all want our communities to thrive. We all want to be healthy, right? And so the question is, what is the role of law enforcement in achieving those goals? And so the question I think you're asking is to invite us to get on the same page. So what is it that law enforcement does? We often talk about violent crime, and the chief sort of pointed to that in terms of homicides and other kinds of violent crimes. But when you look at sort of what police do day to day, only according to a study by the New York Times, there's a handful of large police departments, some in the state of California, and some smaller departments outside of the state of California. Only 8% of the time that police spend in terms of their work is spent on violent crime. And it's obviously reactive. In many cases, right, they're not preventing a homicide, they're investigating the homicide to see who is responsible. And in terms of how many people are actually arrested and prosecuted for things like homicide, right, the clearance rate is something like 60 to 70 60%, something like that. So the efficacy of the investigations are often not where they should be, precisely because of the lack of trust for law enforcement in the communities that are most impacted by violent crime. So when we're talking about, Black communities, because of this history of, Jim Crow, redlining, rampant discrimination that continues to today, Black communities often find themselves in under-resourced communities where police are deployed as a primary mechanism for social problems. So instead, most of the time, officers spend their time responding to non-criminal calls, traffic stops, officer-initiated calls. We can think about Dijon Kizzee, right, who's a man who was killed by by members of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. They stopped him for a bicycle offense, right? And then they claimed that he dropped a gun. There's some explanation for why it was that there was a deadly encounter for a traffic violation. And this bears itself out in terms of, if you just look at a number of cases where police have killed individuals. We're not even talking about basic disrespect, excessive use of force, unlawful arrest. So we can look at Eric Garner. He was killed after police contact because he was accused of selling Lucy, right? So he's not a violent criminal. The sort of boogeyman that we often trot out to justify why police have to be so essential to our notions of public safety. We can think about Philando Castile, who was killed in Minneapolis before George Floyd. He was pulled over for a traffic infraction, and he had a permitted gun that he told the officer about that he never brandished, but the officer, before he could even communicate with him, shot and killed him. We could think about George Floyd himself, who was arrested because of an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. Again, not a violent criminal. These are all petty contacts with law enforcement that are escalated by law enforcement because of some root problems that have to do with the culture. Again, not having to do with any individual officer, but the culture of law enforcement. All too often, law enforcement views Black and brown communities as inherently dangerous, as inherently threatening, and in many ways, in my conversations with sort of line officers, describe them in ways that are animalistic or even sort of dehumanizing. And if you perceive the community that you are supposed to be serving in that way, of course you're going to have outcomes like the ones that we're seeing across the country. So again, there's this culture of viewing Black communities in particular as inherently dangerous. So even a woman who is in her own home, Atatiana Jefferson is shot and killed by a Dallas police officer for simply inquiring as to who's lurking in her own backyard, right? So we're seen as perpetual threats because of the culture of law enforcement and because of how law enforcement was founded and how they continue to operate. We cannot disconnect history from the current moments that we're in, because once the famous quote is, the past is prologue. It informs how we exist today. So the problem is, right, so police don't focus mostly on violent crime, right? They focus on social order. That is what police do. And what kind of social order? They're focused on suppressing problems as it relates to poverty, problems as it relates to mental illness, problems as it relates to unemployment, lack of housing insecurity. And law enforcement isn't equipped to deal with those things. And I think if you ask even the police chief, I don't think they want to deal with these problems. And yet we're asking them to go out and address homelessness in Los Angeles County. We're asking them to address people with mental illnesses. We have the largest provider of mental health in the county of Los Angeles are our jails. The largest provider of housing, I would argue, in Los Angeles County are our jails. And it's not a surprise then that Black folks, poor folks, Latinx folks, and people who are mentally ill are the main ones who are in our jails. And here's the last point that I want to clarify in terms of just getting on the same page. So the chief said that, although Black folks in LA County represent less than 10%, I think it's like 7% of the population, we're 44% of the people responsible for crime. And I want to push back on that. I think we're 44% of the people who are arrested and prosecuted. right? We are the people who are targeted by police. And so therefore, you know, when you look for something, you're going to find it. We don't saturate USC or Fullerton or any other campus where we know people are doing drugs, where we know people are committing crimes, because we're not looking there, right? So we're 44% of the people who are targeted for arrest. We're 44% of the people who are prosecuted, but we are not 44% of the people who are responsible for crime. And I think that should be clarified, right? The statistics that we see are racialized because policing is racialized. And the way we think about crime is racialized. And the people who are targeted are racialized. And so the solution is then we have to get police, we have to marginalize police in our conversations about public safety. Having strong communities means that we will have less violent crime, we'll have less property crime. When you have people who have access to healthcare and housing, when you have people who have access to mental health support, we will have safer, healthier communities that won't need to rely on a saturation of law enforcement to give people some feeling of safety or security, which unfortunately, even a saturation of law enforcement doesn't provide either. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Ocean, and also and all of you guys, thank you for our speakers. You guys are just giving us so much to think about, and we've got some good questions that are coming into the Q&A, and I do want to make sure that we get some time to answer those. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rob, and so we can go into our third segment, and we are at 5:15, so if we can leave some time for Q&A, I think our attendees would appreciate that. But you guys have given us so much to think about, and I really appreciate all of the things that you're truly giving us to chew on.
Yes, thank you so much. And in kind of putting together the panel, Christy and I were interested not only in adding some type of descriptive DNA to the problem or problems, but to try to talk about solutions here, and maybe solutions, you know, come in baby steps here. But my question for the panelists is about reforms, and what types of reforms do you think might have the greatest potential for alleviating some of the problems, but certainly not all, that we've discussed this evening? So for example, I think it was Saul who mentioned training. One of the things that Christy and I looked at was like the number of hours, generally speaking, the number of hours that police were trained in firearms use of force versus kind of de-escalation techniques or conflict resolution. What types of reforms come to mind that might provide some type of solution set to, if not like eliminate some of the problems we've discussed tonight, help tap down on them, help minimize them, help take some of the air out of the deadly encounters that we've, you know, all experienced, that we've all seen this past summer. Saul, can I ask you to chime in here with respect to what you see as being, I know that you've worked on very actively on particular projects with cities, so something specific that that you think can really help things out here.
Thank you. I think that the larger project of right-sizing the role of our police and the budgets to support them to carry out a very specific set of tasks that can point to a future in which they are not absorbing vicarious trauma and then reproducing trauma is a very important piece of work in this time period. And what I mean by that is that the examples that I gave that asked the question of what is appropriate for us to expect a police officer to be able to be charged to doing in their day-to-day work that may not have to actually involve a police officer? And what does that open up in terms of thinking about where their role might be more appropriate is an important piece of work, because I do think that on some level, some of that, the best results for that kind of inquiry are going to be localized. They're going to be examining the dispatch records for a particular jurisdiction and asking ourselves, oh, if the majority of calls that involve the kind of thing that residents expect to be protected from is actually an identifiable source that can be distinguished from a generalized duty to respond to hundreds, if not thousands, of 911 calls, either resident initiated calls, business initiated, that maybe don't have to involve a police officer, that we're going to have, I think, a lot of creative solutions that speak to the decentralized nature of this particular profession. The other thing that I want to mention that I'm involved in my work at UCLA in what was referenced earlier as the future of work in a decarcerated California. The inquiry there is also, what if we look at this as a question of an occupational role, right? Not necessarily a social role, but rather, what is it that we think should live under the title of law enforcement officer? And what is it that we expect those institutions to be able to do to equip those folks to do that work in such a way that doesn't presume exponential growth year after year, and doesn't demand a kind of discourse about the communities that are being served to reproduce any stereotypes or to make any assumptions around a subset of people there. And I think that for me, getting change agents within police departments into that conversation is important, because they are going to be critical in naming what the arc of their day looks like, what the range of things that they do that could be different, and speak into the spirit of that kind of an inquiry. And that's what we're trying to facilitate in this group. I actually work with a former probation officer and a former member of the Prison Guards Union, who have been involved in studies that are looking at things like the kinds of worker wellness questions that we would ask in any other profession. You know, what are the levels of suicidal ideation, of domestic violence, of any kind of indicators that can tell us there's something that we want to ask, both from within and outside of the current shape of policing, that could point us to answers around how this could be better for everybody. So for me, as an organizer, as somebody who does civic engagement work, and that's about bringing people with different points of view to a common question, that is one of the most important things that we can do. On the other hand, you know, I think that it's important for us to keep our eye on the prize, which is that structural conditions require structural answers that are also driven by things that are within our control to do legislatively. So you had asked the question in preparation to tonight about what do we think regarding, you know, qualified immunity. Well, I think that that's an empirical question, right? We can find out, is it true that, you know, officers end up paying out of their own pocket, or that there are a lot of frivolous lawsuits filed, or that there are other ways that taking out this protection that currently makes it very difficult for departments to change, not individual behavior to be punished, but for departments to be changed, that could be different. We could study that. We could do that in the context of producing legislation that says, look, if you have an indemnification agreement through your labor negotiations or through some other agreement with the city that you work for, and that's going to give you a protection as an officer who can make a reasonable mistake in a split second and not feel like you are under the microscope and yourself in harm's way, then that might allow us to sort of take the charge out of the debate over these kinds of things and be able to say, maybe we do need a legislative change, such as the one that was pursued and changed in this state around the use of force very recently, which was actually pioneered by a former police officer who's now our elected DA here, which is to say, I couldn't prosecute somebody under the current standard, but the standard itself didn't need to be what it was. And so let's get together with other law enforcement agencies and try to change that standard. So I think some of the changes coming from that kind of work at the top in terms of legislation that could apply across, like in that case, the entire state, and some of these ideas coming up from the bottom in the localized jurisdictions, that's going to get us to a different place.
Chief Goodman, can I pick up on a theme that Saul had mentioned, and in fact that's been a prevalent theme throughout the night, and that's been policing culture. And I know from your own background, you've been a huge supporter of community-oriented policing, probably when it wasn't that highly popular within the general police community in and of itself. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on if, given what has transpired and given the kind of social outcry for justice from so many corners of our nation, if part of the solution is a change in police culture. And I know that there's been some scholarship, and Christy can speak to this better than I can, but kind of a move away from a traditional or conventional model of being a warrior out there on the streets versus being a guardian of the community. Is there something about the culture of modern day policing that needs to be transformed?
Absolutely. There's no police chief that I'm aware of, and I talked to several. I'm a part of a police chief organization that does not agree that we do need to consider reforms. We've been in the business of reform. In fact, California agencies have led the nation in reforms, and obviously that work's not done. There's still a lot of work left to do, but I think part of the thing that keeps us from reaching some of the goals that we've endeavored to attain is this difficult conversation about our role versus the community's role. We generally stop the conversation at what the police are doing and what the police have done, and we fall short in talking about what the police are reacting to, and what the public has asked us to do. And we started that conversation here on this panel, and I'd love to go back to it because I wanted to stand up and scream hallelujah when Dr. Ocean mentioned the very fact that we're being asked to do things that we would rather not do. We would rather not have to be psychologists. We would rather not have to deal with all of the other issues that are not related to police work. But as I said earlier, because we have not spent enough time talking about those failed systems, and the fact that the police departments are often the recipient of those failed systems, because 911 is the easiest number to remember. People call us because we're there 24 hours a day. Social services workers go home at 5 o'clock. So if someone's having an issue with someone in their neighborhood that's causing a problem, whether they know that they're suffering from mental illness or not, they call us. We show up. And most of us have training now in CIT, critical incident training, but oftentimes we can't make a diagnosis of a person exhibiting unusual behavior. If there's a threat for violence, we have to deal with that threat for violence first. And that doesn't play out well in a 2-minute video snippet. But these are the things that people are asking to change now. They're asking for us not to go to these things and to send a social worker or to send someone else who doesn't have a badge or doesn't have a gun. I would love to see that play out. I just don't know how that would actually work in reality, when a lot of times these incidents don't start out as violent, but they end up that way. A lot of times, we go to something that seems benign. We do end up doing a lot of policing that is not focused on violent encounters, but they turn out that way because of the behavior and because of the choices that individuals make.
Okay. Professor Ocean, any kind of solution-oriented recommendations here that you think can help?
Yeah, so we have, over the course of the last 50 to 75 years, exponentially increased the amount of money that we spend on law enforcement and policing. And again, I mean that quite broadly, to include things like schools, where now we have school resource officers, police officers in schools. We have, fraud, criminal fraud as an integral part of social welfare institutions. Even things like Department of Children and Family Services are deeply steeped in law enforcement tactics and logics. And so we have this sort of way in which we view all kinds of social problems through the prism of crime and through the prism of punishment. And that, I think, fundamentally needs to be challenged. We also need to reduce the footprint of law enforcement so that we don't have as many contacts that are, again, I think rather unnecessary for some of the reasons that Chief Goodman mentioned. So that means that we need to have penal code reform, right? Police officers act as a result of the authorization that our legislatures, that our local county board of supervisors or local city councils or other sort of formations give to law enforcement. And over, again, that same period of time, not only are we investing more resources in law enforcement, we're giving them more crimes to investigate and prosecute. Every single year, our penal code is expanding, and I think that there needs to be serious reconsideration of the kinds of things that we criminalize and why, right? Do we think about how drug use or mental illness, poverty, or other kinds of racial discrimination impact how people behave and impact then the kinds of social problems that we see law enforcement responding to. So I think we need to rethink what crime is and what law enforcement should be responding to. We need to reduce the footprint of law enforcement, reduce the scope of behavior that's considered to be criminal. And I think once we can do that, we can redirect resources from the police into what I think are supportive institutions, which we have deprived of resources over that same period of time. There has been a distributional effect where, social welfare, education, employment training, housing, public health, access to healthcare has been starved for resources. So we have been defunding the kinds of institutions that help us to have a healthy ecosystem in our community in order to fund law enforcement. And I think that pattern has to be reversed as part of a broader plan to reduce the footprint of law enforcement and to really call on the real skills, the strength of our communities. I think I agree 100% with Chief Goodman. We need to rely on our communities to address these problems, but they can't do it on their own, and they can't do it in a piecemeal fashion. We have to give our communities the kind of resources that they need to address the problems that we're now asking law enforcement to do, and they're doing so in a way that they're not equipped. And it doesn't matter how much training we give law enforcement. We can give implicit bias training until we're blue in the face. We can give de-escalation training until we're blue in the face, but it will not fundamentally change, I think, not only deadly use of force, but broader excessive use of force. It doesn't lead to a loss of life, but seriously injures an individual or the community. And then we should also note, in terms of the gender dimensions of this, that sexual assault is the second highest kind of complaint levied against law enforcement. So it's excessive force and then sexual abuse. So we need to be talking about, and all of this comes as a result of police contact with the community that in most cases, I think, could be handled by other institutions. So as Saul said, right, can we think of, do police need to enforce traffic regulations? No. Do police have to be present in our schools? No. Do police need to be on the front line of housing insecurity? No. Do police need to be dealing with mental health crises? No. And yet that's what they spend 80% of their time doing. And we should have other institutional actors that can engage in rapid response and can support community thriving. One of the things that we've done here in LA County just recently is to enact something called Measure J, which will set aside 10% of all unrestricted county dollars for community reinvestment. And I think that's an important step. In addition to that, of course, we do need a reform of standards regarding police use of force, which thankfully here in the state of California, based on the leadership of my mentor, Dr. Shirley Weber, there's been some changes in state law, not as far as I think it should have gone, and certainly I'm sure not as far as Dr. Weber would have liked it to go. But for the first time since 1876, we changed the law regarding police use of force in the state of California, which I hope will go a long way to reducing the number of deadly shootings in our communities. We need to reform qualified immunity. We need to restrict the kind of money that police unions and correctional officer unions pour into our political process, because it corrupts it, right? We're supposed to have a form of democratic governance where our state representatives and our local representatives are to direct what law enforcement does and not the other way around. Police should not be picking the people who write the laws and the people who are supposed to be providing oversight. The people should be picking those people. And so we need to get police unions. I respect the rights of I respect the right of each of us to collective bargain. And I respect the dignity of labor. And I think police unions should exist. I just don't think that they should be permitted to participate in the political system in the way that they do because of the corrosive effects that it can have on democracy. And so those are just a few suggestions that I have. But fundamentally, we need to reduce the footprint of law enforcement and redirect those funds into our communities so that we can support communities in maintaining safe and healthy environments that allow people to thrive without fear of violence from their neighbors or from a police officer.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, can I ask do we have time to ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
If police shouldn't be involved in the political process, aren't you suggesting then that they don't get allowed the same democratic rights as every other American citizen?
No, I'm not saying that police shouldn't be able to vote. You have the right to vote just as I can. But I do think, for example, the amount of money that the police unions have spent in our district attorney's office races, I think is deeply problematic because of what it pretends in terms of how the district attorney might respond to, for example, police shootings or allegations of police misconduct. I do think that there should be some bright lines in terms of where police are different. They're not like any other union. And I do think that they're, because of the monopoly on violence that police have, there's like no other profession aside from the military where the state authorizes that individual to use deadly force. And I think that we shouldn't be blind to that basic fact. And so because of that, I think that there should be some limitations in terms of where police unions spend their money in terms of political contributions. I know that may be controversial, and there are certainly arguments around free speech, but I think that there are countervailing public safety reasons and countervailing anti-corruption, countervailing democratic arguments around democratic governance that would militate in favor of restrictions on how police unions can participate in the political process in terms of campaign contributions.
I also wanted to, if we have time,
please,
to add a little bit to that. I think again, it would be really helpful to take these questions out of the abstract and into the concrete. Whatever your view is about what level of involvement a police union should have in the DA's race, we live in a county where a former policeman who has also spent many decades now working with communities to reform state laws that were responsible for a lot of the pipeline into the jails and prisons. One, the change agents within the law enforcement community are living in a moment where they can actually partner with somebody who the community members who have a range of views around police officers, right? Including some people who are like, I'm never going to trust this guy. I don't care what he's written, what law he was responsible for. I just do not trust him because he's a cop. And we had to deal with that during this campaign. Here's a moment in which we can very concretely invite the change agents in the law enforcement community to partner with the DA, who has basically been doing this work with communities throughout the state of California and even in Arizona, when Sheriff Arpaio for Latino communities represented the worst, and the court system, which very rarely issues a judgment of racial discrimination based on these kinds of activities, did before that sheriff was pardoned by President Trump, is now in office, at least for the next 4 years in this county. And I think that this is a moment where that level of experimentation, that level of bridging the polarization is possible for us to be able to see, challenge folks in the community who would like to paint all cops in one brush, to say the DA in LA County is the DA, and what are the changes that you want? And he is a former policeman, but he's also somebody who, like the chief here, has pursued higher education, and he's basically got a law degree, and that's what allows him to be the DA. And so I want to encourage that, and I want to respond to in relation to that, to the question in the chat about whether or not what we're implying is that the reason community members don't cooperate with police is because they are more afraid of working with the police than the fear they have of being retaliated against by people perpetrating crime. And I think when you look at communities, particularly immigrant communities, you have a reticence because of the kinds of fears related to the work, the kinds of figures that Sheriff Arpaio represents within law enforcement that make it hard for people to come forward. I think we who lived through the Rampart scandal here in Los Angeles, where people were framed in sort of these very extreme corruption scandals, are also reasons why people don't come forward. It's never an either or. It doesn't help any of us to paint all of law enforcement in the image of Joe Arpaio, and it doesn't it doesn't help for all law enforcement unions to paint a former police officer, Gascon, as being an enemy of their interests.
So I know that Christine and I wanted to save time for the chat questions. And so one that's right in front of me right now is for Chief Goodman. So I'm going to go ahead and read it, Chief, and if you signaled that you'd like to respond to this question. And the question is as follows. Do we have a collective responsibility to hold our communities responsible when they purposefully disregard complying with officer commands?
Well, I think I've been touching on that through most of my comments in regard to the accountability piece and the personal responsibility. I understand that we're at a place where people feel that police can't be trusted. People feel like their personal animus or their historical perspectives about the legitimacy of police give them cause to push back, give them cause to resist, give them cause to not comply. But there are mechanisms for that. and if you feel that, you're being treated unjustly, I strongly urge as a plea for safety of individuals and protection of their rights, to take those complaints, to the appropriate place, which would be complaining at the agency, complaining to your attorney, but do not resist on the streets. Those actions are exactly what lead to violent encounters, because police don't have the ability to determine whether your resistance, physical or otherwise, is a precursor to a threat against their life. And that's, an unfortunate component of almost every instance that we can discuss, every single one.
So if I can just take us back to the unions, right? So each of you guys touched on the power of police unions and the culture within policing, right? So I'm going to take us back to our first question that we received, which is, how do police unions contribute to the issue? And I want to take it a step further in knowing that police unions are powerful. How do we work with police unions to get the reforms that we need, not watered down versions of reforms that we want, but how do we work with police unions alongside with those, we hear over and over again, right? Good, no one hates a bad officer more than a good officer. So how do we get those good officers, those good union reps to come alongside and support the reforms legislatively or within each agency's policy, or to change the culture? How do we get them on board to be these change agents within our departments and within our states? And whoever wants to take that first, I will offer it up. Chief, do you want to head it first? Or Professor, go ahead.
So I think, over the last, especially 40 years, police unions, and I'm saying police quite broadly, I mean, we have police unions that represent, for example, in Los Angeles, we represent members of the LAPD. We have the Professional Peace Officers Association, which represents the leadership of the Sheriff's Department. We have ALADS, which is the Association of Los Angeles Sheriff's Deputies, which represents deputies. So there are a lot, and we have prison guard unions. And so these unions proliferate across the state. We have police chief of police. I don't think it's a union, but they certainly coordinate around public policy. And police spend heavily in political races to get their candidate of choice elected, which is entirely permissible under current law. I think if we were to change the scenario and we had members of the military leadership, right, shaping and spending in political races and pressuring members of Congress to do certain things outside of the scope of their, that doesn't relate just to their employment, but to political conditions, I think we would have some concerns about our democratic process of governance. And I think it's the same issue with regard to the amount of spending that police unions put into races, for example, like DA. Setting that aside, however, when you look at the role of police unions in relationship to reform, all too often police unions have been an obstacle. They have tried to block efforts, for example, to make, I think, very reasonable changes to the standards related to police use of force. They have attempted to undermine or roll back reforms related to, for example, Proposition 47, which reclassified certain kinds of felonies to misdemeanors, which has had a dramatic effect on the number of people who are serving time in our state prisons. And the list goes on. Almost every meaningful kind of reform related to our criminal justice system has been resisted by police unions. And I think that's unfortunate because I think they could play a more constructive role, but they choose not to. They often reflexively defend officers who have used deadly force, even though when you look at the evidence, it's seemingly indefensible. And so as a result, I think police unions have lost a lot of credibility over the last few election cycles. politicians have made a big deal of saying that they won't take money from police unions. And I think if police unions want to continue to be relevant in these conversations, I think they have to be more amenable to actually negotiating and making concessions and acknowledging the real, deep, and pervasive historical contemporary problems that exist within law enforcement if they're going to be good partners. So it's not to say that police departments and members of law enforcement shouldn't have any role in how we talk about public safety and accountability, but I think that should be a role that's productive and realistic, and one that is really grounded in lived experiences of the people that they police. I think that has to be acknowledged. And the idea that that police, the idea that individuals in the community are responsible, for example, for their own deaths, I think is unfortunate. The sort of idea that individuals have a responsibility to so-called comply with law enforcement. You can look at so many cases where police are the ones that are escalating the situation. And where law enforcement, they're the ones with the guns. They're the ones that are trained. They're supposed to be trained to deal with the public. And all too often, we're being told, particularly as someone who's a Black person, I'm being told how to navigate and manage a police officer rather than police officers being held accountable for when they fail to maintain the peace and they resort to a use of force. I think a resort to a use of force is a failure on a police officer's part. And I think that has to be said, and it needs to be something that is actually enforced. When we think about complaints that are rendered, there's a report that's the data that's going to be based on data from the state AG's office that found that of the thousands of complaints of racial profiling that were filed by residents of the state of California, less than 1% were sustained. I don't know how that can be the case. Thousands of complaints and less than 1% are sustained. So there's a real disjuncture between the lived experiences of what people, particularly people of color, particularly poor people, experience with law enforcement, and then the outright denials that we so often see come from not leadership of police departments. I think leadership of sheriff and police departments, I think they're more reasonable, and I think that they engage more with the lived realities of law enforcement. But I think from police unions, there's all too often a reflexive rejection of any kind of productive suggestion for reform. And that needs to change if we're going to have meaningful shifts in law enforcement and in public safety.
There was a question in chat. I can't.
Sorry, can we just? Sorry, Rob. Before we head on to a different question, can we hear from Saul and Chief Goodman on that?
Sure.
On the issue of police unions.
Yeah, and how do we, given their history of resistance in a lot of cases, how do we bring them alongside? They're very powerful. They can absolutely be change agents within the right, having the right people. How do you bring those people in? How do you make these changes? Is that possible or is that impossible?
I think that each person's experience is their own, and the elements that Dr. Ocean mentioned based on her work and her exposure to some of the larger unions in Los Angeles, that may be an issue, and I won't argue that or try to defend it. But what I will say is that police unions, do have a role that goes beyond political activism. Their role is to protect the rights of employees. Their role is to negotiate for benefits for employees, just like any other union, for healthcare and equitable wages. And I don't agree with the sweeping notion that because police unions do try to seek to balance some of the reforms when they are extreme. Like I just heard her say that any use of force is a failure. Well, I would challenge someone to go out on the streets and get socked in the face because you're asking someone for their license and say that, defending yourself is a failure. I mean, there's violence that happens out there and is perpetrated against police officers on a regular basis, and I'm not defending those issues that are questionable or that are flat wrong. On the part of police officers. I own that, and I'm here on this panel because I care about making that right. But I reject the notion that anytime we use force, we have failed. You know, we do have citizens who have a part to play in encounters with police. And compliance is not submission. Compliance is not disrespect. Compliance is about the requirement that you have to follow the law. If you're given a lawful order, then compliance should be the norm. But we have gotten so far out of societal norms of respecting authority, of respecting law enforcement, that now we're at a place where it's commonplace for people to just fight the police, or people to think that resistance is a means to resolving a police encounter. And I don't think that police unions, when they're evaluating cases that come from one of their constituents, if you will, or one of their members, are wrong for wanting to make sure that the process is fair, that due process is provided, and that discipline is relative to the issue at hand. I think that's an appropriate issue for police unions to take on.
Saul, I think Christine wanted you to chime in on this issue.
I think the piece that jumps out more for me on this is what the chief just inferred is the primary role of any union, and particularly the police union, which is it's an empirical question around whether or not members of, whether it's a prison guards union, a probation officers union, or police officers union, feel that the union's work has been focused on the benefits that they want, that address some of the cultural issues that affect them as workers as well. And I think that if we could ask the labor movement to create ways for people inside of those departments to come forward and discuss, whether it really matters to them that their union pour millions of dollars into opposing reforms like Prop 47 versus negotiating things that address the changing conditions of their employment, that we will find some space to work with those unions. And I'm saying this because, again, direct experience in another county project with probation guards union, we found that the line staff that were doing a lot of this hard work had no idea that their leadership was necessarily focused on opposing things like getting rid of solitary confinement for young people in probation camps. They agreed that their jobs were jobs where they were absorbing vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and things that basically hardened them for why they took the job to begin with, and that they wanted their union to do more work around improving the working conditions that they had. So I do think that, to answer your question, Christine, that would be a really good point of departure, and another way to look at police unions as part of what the larger ecology of labor unions is supposed to be for.
There was actually a question in chat. I don't have it in front of me right now, but it had to do with trust, and trust seems to be a theme that keeps kind of resurfacing in our discussions this evening. And I wanted to know from all of you, what your thinking was with respect to how police institutions can begin to build back trust with the communities that they serve. Is there a role for better hiring, more transparency here? I know that from my perspective, when you see things like kind of, and this is not Upland, by the way, this is different agencies here, kind of gangs of deputy sheriffs kind of operating within their official capacity. Recently, there was a report by the FBI and supplemented by the Brennan Center at New York University that documented how the affiliation of police officers with white supremacist organizations or militias, which is far greater than was previously known. and Congress calling high officials from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection to answer for why is there a Facebook page, made up of CBP officers and officials that are, on social media saying dehumanizing things about immigrants and insulting things about elected officials that are calling for more humane treatment of immigrants. Can better hiring and transparency kind of address some of these matters to a skeptical public?
No, I think yes. I think a lot of that part does go back to police unions, in my opinion. I think that if police chiefs become aware of something like that, that type of thing disgusts me and is an embarrassment as a black eye to law enforcement, and I don't think many would disagree. But even in something like that, I couldn't go to the immediate step of termination without having to go through the process of due process. So in some ways, that's where I think the disconnect is with the public in terms of trust, because we still have to give an officer due process, even for some of the things that are most egregious. Now, of course, they get put off work. We would put them on administrative leave immediately so that there's not a continued potential for whatever behavior there was that was determined to be inappropriate. But the public not understanding that process, sometimes associates that with accepting said behavior or trying to cover up said behavior, but it's a part of what's required. Now, to the larger issue of trust, I think that it all connects. When we can do more to hold ourselves accountable, when we can do more to engage the public where they are, and truly listen empathetically and understand the needs of different communities. I wish that I could get these opportunities more often. I have a desire to start a program here in my community that will probably mirror some that are in other agencies, where we have our officers do ride-alongs with community members. We have a program now where we offer them to come and ride along with us, but having officers go into communities of some underserved neighborhoods and see what it's like, a day in the life of a kid having to get to and from school in a disadvantaged community, and know what they go through when they have to get home after school and fend for themselves, just so that they can understand the differences in some cultural dynamics. All of those things, in my opinion, help tremendously, but it doesn't change the fact that we hire law enforcement officers from the same community and from the same society that every other industry does. So we're invariably going to find people who are flawed. We're invariably going to find people who have, issues, putting it bluntly, because we're hiring from the same human race that is a part of our entire society that's flawed.
Christy, I think we're at the 6 o'clock mark. Is there a concluding question you wanted to maybe touch on, or?
I think maybe just there are several questions in the chat that we're not going to be able to get to, unfortunately. Maybe just ask each of our panelists to maybe make a concluding statement, something you want to leave on. And thank you guys for your time and expertise today. We really appreciate it. So with that, if you guys want to make one kind of concluding statement, that would be great.
I can offer to go first. First of all, just like was mentioned in the chat recently, I just really appreciate everybody willing to, dig into what is a very complex question and one that has a lot of layers to the onion to peel. In that spirit, I think it would behoove us to name that in this county, we are actually in a really historical moment on these questions. We are seeing that there was an appetite and a very effective channeling of the kind of raw emotion that came out of the summer uprisings and all of the protests against systemic racism and policing into some very clear changes. I mentioned the election of a former police officer who's also engaged in reform work across the county as our DA. And I think Priscilla mentioned the passage of the voters of a historical measure that would indicate that for that part of the budget that is discretionary, a fixed amount go to meeting human needs before it goes to meeting our policing function. And I think that whatever informed whether or not you opposed or favored those kinds of changes, they're here now. There's been a historic approval of an alternatives to incarceration framework that has built on many years. The governor has ordered the shutdown of our state prison system and authorized a redesign of what we do in our youth probation camps and our youth juvenile halls. This is a moment where I think we need to walk towards each other and bring our insights from various perspectives and be able to lean into those changes and bring these perspectives into a process that can get us to the next step in these kinds of progress. And whether you call them reforms or whether you call them steps towards a more reimagined function in the future, it's where we're at. And I would just invite everybody to look into them and bring their voice to them.
So here's what I would say. I think we all agree that we want more fund. We want our educational system to be excellent. We want people to have housing. We want people to have health care. We want people to be healthy. We want people to be self-actualized and be able to chart a meaningful course for their lives, for their families, and for their communities. I think whether you wear a uniform or not, that's what we want. And we want institutions that can help us to get to that place where everyone in our community feels that they have access to the resources that they need, where everyone in our community feels safe and secure, and that they're valued and treated equitably and equally, and that their human dignity is respected. I think everyone would agree with that. The fact that we don't have the kind of support for institutions that can help enable us to live in that kind of society is a collective failure. I think we focus on policing, obviously, because these are spectacular forms of violence where people lose their lives or they lose their families because they're incarcerated. But I think the failure is on all of us, because we have allowed a society that has placed the burden of solving almost all of our social problems on the police, big and small. We have allowed a society and enabled a society that has essentially removed any forms of accountability for police misconduct. And that's not just for police unions, that's our legislature, that's our city councils, that's our board of supervisors, it's our courts. We have all failed, and I think we need to own that. And in order for us to correct the problems that prevent us from living in a society where everyone can thrive, feel supported, and feel respected, we have to begin to address the corruptions in how we allocate our resources. And that means that we have to fundamentally address the allocation of resources to police, and redirect those funds into the kinds of institutions that can help us to build up the kinds of communities that we want to live in. That's the big question. It's a big task, and we'll need every person in order to achieve that task. So thanks so much for bringing everyone together. Thanks to the 50 people who stayed to the bitter end. Thank you, professors, for inviting us. Thank you, Chief Goodman. And of course, to my homeboy, Saul, it's great to see you and great to be in conversation with you.
Yes, thank you all for your time and expertise. Priscilla, being from Ontario, you should know about Juan Pollo. It's a great
Oh,
chicken.
that was like my favorite place. I went to Deanza. That was like right on. Was that Euclid? Yeah,
On
that was
Euclid,
on my way. Absolutely. Yep.
You know it's not there anymore, right?
It
I
closed
heard.
down.
I was so disappointed.
I was
so
crushed.
disappointed.
I
That
was
chicken,
crushed by-
I've never had as good chicken as I've had at a Pollo Loco. Not in the decade since.
Good night, everyone.
Thank
Good
you,
night,
guys.
Christy.
I appreciate it, and really appreciate.
Chief, do you want to say your last statement?
Actually, you know what? What Dr. Ocean said was spectacular. I agree with all those points, and I would just be being redundant. The only thing I will add is that as a police chief and as a member of the police community, I know that this is important for all of us, and we want to do better. And my commitment is to try to do better. So I hope that we have more dialogues like this because I think this is a step in the right direction. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And for those attendees, please have these difficult conversations with friends, with family. If you don't know anything about law enforcement, go learn about law enforcement. If you don't know anything about critical race theory, learn about critical race theory. Learn about both sides. Understand people who are different than you. Have those conversations. Ask questions respectfully and be open to answering those questions about yourself and your situation. And that's the way we can move forward and address so much of this. But have those critical conversations. And thank you guys for having this difficult conversation and bringing us together.